Telegraph story and the then BHA response to it.
Yeah, morning. Well, we all left a bit of a nasty taste in the mouth, really. I mean, there's a time and a place for casting doubt upon figures of authority, and in my opinion, unfortunately, the trainers in charge of sending those emails to BHA, I mean, I think they got it woefully wrong. I mean, aside from anything else, it's a pretty dastardly way of going about things, and it's pretty, in my opinion, it's pretty snaky. And anytime anyone is asking for removal of somebody's kind of livelihood at the top of a tree like the BHA, there needs to be a jolly good reason behind it. And unfortunately, I'm very much of the opinion that the reasoning behind the actions of Mark Johnston, Rafe Beckett, and various others was completely wrong and in no way deserves an email of that magnitude demanding the removal of the head of the BHA. And I think the response from the BHA was pretty calm, actually, and I thought it was very well thought out. And I think they could have gone in a bit harder, because I'd imagine they would be absolutely furious about it. I mean, what you've got to remember at the end of the day is that Nick Rust and everyone else in racing is trying their utmost to get racing back on track. And for those few trainers to kind of be arrogant enough almost to come out and say that they're not doing a good enough job is really pretty extraordinary. So I thought it was a very tempered response from the BHA to what was a pretty extraordinary series of emails, really.
Lee, we were on air at the time when this all sort of came out, as I mentioned earlier. You've now had a chance to sort of gather your thoughts, if you like, have a sort of an in-depth think about it. Where are you now, sort of 2 or 3 days on with this?
Well, I have to say that Tom's response was very much in line with what most of the racing media thought, that the trainers shouldn't have said what they did in the way that they said it, and that the BHA was right effectively just to dismiss it. It's fair to say that Nick Rust will not be standing down anytime soon, although he is going to go at the end of the year, but that's because he's working out his notice, because he's already going to move on to something else. I do think we should cut the trainers a bit of slack, though, because there are many people who are trying to run businesses at the moment who are getting very frustrated, and they can see their businesses slowly going down the tube. And I suspect that racehorse trainers and owners can see racing taking place in other countries. Obviously, every country is different. They can see, like Hong Kong today, they can see it happening there, and they're asking themselves the question, why can't it happen here? Maybe their response was a bit strong, but I think in the circumstances that we're in at the moment, I think we should all feel sorry for people who are in a position whereby they feel that their futures may be disappearing before their eyes, and they would like the BHA just to move a bit quicker.
I mean, Tom, when we look at this situation, let's be honest, none of us really knows what's going on, and it's just a case of we have to, well, allow time. And while I hate the phrase, but the curve that we are on at the moment, you just have to get to the end point of it, and none of us really knows as to where we are in this continuum. So while I understand the calls, we've got this constant debate about the Premier League returning and whatever. We just don't know where we are at the moment, and if, as you said earlier, if the tone of what the trainers were saying kind of just seemed to miss the mood, really.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you. It just seems odd that they think they're above everyone else in terms of all other sport, all other businesses, in saying basically that they can return to normal quicker than everyone else can. I mean, apart from anything else, for racing to come back, the infection rate needs to have gone down significantly. Pressure on hospitals needs to have lifted considerably, and racing needs to prove that it can cope with running race meetings in a safe environment. A place where we're definitely not at yet. And obviously, this is going to be something that Nick Rust and the BHA team are going to be spending most of their waking hours doing. I mean, the fact that they've come up with a plan to return to action as soon as the government gives the green light to do so at these isolated hubs at both Newmarket and Newcastle, before presumably other tracks will get going as well, where these hubs will more than likely have kind of private healthcare services with their own ways of testing, etc., as well as they're obviously enforcing strict social distancing rules. It just begs the question, what else really can Nick Rust be doing? I mean, I completely agree with Lee in the fact that these trainers are obviously going to be worried about their livelihoods. But the fact is, these are unprecedented times. Everyone, and I repeat, everyone, as we all know, is in the same boat. All these businesses are under pressure. And the only thing they can do really is to sit and wait it out and not take any preemptive action. And one of the interesting things they said was that the BHA has always cared more about public perception than its participants. And I mean, let's be honest, perception has always been a big part of the BHA's handling of affairs, the way that racing looks to the public. That is true. But this really has nothing to do with public perception. And if they want racing to come back sooner than everything else, the perception of the public will be that racing is full of arrogant so-and-sos, and basically they've completely backfired. So for me, it was a very, very misplaced thing to do from these trainers, and I think the response has been completely appropriate.
Right. Okay. Let's if you like take it forward and let's try and be a bit more positive in terms of when racing comes back. We know it's going to be behind closed doors to start with, basically like everything else. So we're going to take that as read. One of the things that we've spoken about that has been the problem for racing is the fact that they need 2 ambulances at the course at any one meeting. Lee, do you remember when we spoke to Emmett Kennedy? I think he said a couple of weeks ago when we spoke to him on the Sunday action from Shartin, he said that the Coolmore boys had actually, if you like, funded private ambulances to actually do it. So they therefore didn't rely on the Irish Health Service for their medical provision on courses. If ambulances are, if you like, going to be one of the major stumbling blocks, is there a facility in Great Britain, in the mainland, where actually private medical services could be bought in, and therefore there wouldn't be the pressure on the NHS service, for instance? Yes. If that is the big stumbling block, is there a way around it?
It's a stumbling block, and yes, it's feasible as long as those private medical services that you're talking about would not be required to back up the National Health Service if the pandemic got much worse than it is at the moment. If you got to a point where there were medical staff and there were ambulances that were clearly not being used, parked up for days on end, and they were not likely to be used, then I think that is possible to overcome that ambulance issue. But again, it's a case of where we are maybe in 2 or 3 weeks' time. It's not going to happen straight away. And then there are the other issues about the government saying no unnecessary travel. But of course, you then got to say, is going to a horse race meeting where people earn money. We're not talking about the public here, but the people who are taking part in it, earning money, keeping the business ticking over. Is that unnecessary, or is that actually an important part of the country's future? And then the social distancing is the other thing, which I think we've seen in Hong Kong is possible to do. I think it's easier in horse racing than it is in most other sports. So yeah, those 3 component parts, and one by one they will be looked at, and you do feel as if by the end of May, we may just about be there and be able to do something behind closed doors. But the ambulance situation is something that can be solved, but we have to be sure that those ambulances, whether they be private ones or National Health Service ones, are not going to be required somewhere else at the same time as they're taking 3 injured jockeys to hospital.
Well, I mean, Tom, looking at it, looking at horse racing, and behind closed doors, we'll state it again, but that would seem to have more merit than allowing people to go to a DIY store to buy a tin of paint. I mean, we're told it's supposed to be for essential journeys only. I can't see how going to buy a tin of paint or a new garden set, that comes into the essential part of life.
Well, indeed. And I mean, one thing you've got to think about as well is that behind closed doors racing has been effective in various countries so far, other than England. And I think ahead of other sports, we are definitely in a better position to get going sooner, just because social distancing has proven that it can be done in these other countries. And team sports like football and rugby and cricket, it's going to be a lot more difficult to enforce these measures, which is why, of course, we're seeing, particularly in France, they've just come out and said that that sports will be suspended until September, but racing does not fall under that category because it is not actually technically a sport in France. It's under agriculture for some reason I'm not aware of. But over here, that does give us kind of optimism that racing can return perhaps sooner than other sports, particularly as we've already mentioned with this private healthcare services that we are potentially able to get. So there is definitely grounds for optimism here for racing, and it would be a surprise to me if we weren't able to get up and running in time for the first classics of the season, which are the beginning of June, which have already been rearranged and delayed by a month, the 2,000 and 1,000 guineas. I'd be looking to hopefully get back a couple of weeks before then, provided obviously that easing of restrictions, because that would give horses enough time to kind of get into fitness, with trainers getting enough notice to run their horses in these big races. So I think there is definitely grounds for optimism here, particularly because racing has such kind of big caveats that other sports don't have. So fingers crossed we can get going again. And the example of other countries definitely makes me look forward to the return.
Tom, thank you so much for joining us.